We're thinking about topics that are related to the talk that Matt gave on the image of God and the effects of sin. For our first topic that we're going to discuss in this video, we're going to talk about what sin is and how Matt's definition of sin in the lesson can be squared with what we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament and how they talk about sin. So, Matt, in your talk, you repeatedly define sin in terms of a failure to be truly human. So if we understand it like that, sin is sort of like almost like an illness or something. Like you think about it in terms of your well-being as a human. But when we look at, say, the Old Testament particularly, and we look at books like Leviticus or something, sin seems to get defined in terms of like breaking a rule or like breaking a command given by God. And these commands often don't seem to have anything obviously connected to our well-being. I mean, some of them are, like don't murder your neighbor. Great, that makes a lot of sense. But there's a lot that don't seem to be connected to it like that at all. There's a lot of rules about how to give offerings, or there's a lot of rules about what animals to eat, or about keeping the Sabbath, things like that. So how do we reconcile this idea of sin that you articulated in the talk with what we see when we look at the Old Testament or the New Testament for that matter?
Yeah, so I think the way of understanding sin that I've usually been explained has been in terms of rules and in terms of rule keeping and the fact that we haven't been able to measure up to a particular standard that's expected. And I guess, yeah, what I put forward in the lesson is something that does seem a little bit different to that. I think the way that one of the differences that came out to me between the way that I'd kind of always thought about sin in the past and the way that I explained it in the lesson is that it's more close to home, and where the way that I explained it in the lesson seems to really hit upon say the dignity of humans. So some of the examples that I used about caring for the foreigner or the stranger or the oppressed, the concern that God has for slaves being the God who brought his own people out of slavery. It seems very much in line with the dignity and the worth that we have as humans, whereas something like food laws doesn't seem to quite hit on the same points or have the same sort of, I guess, intrinsic depth to it. I think that's certainly something that creates a bit of a tension for us. That, sure, on one level, there's something hard-hitting about defining sin in that way, defining sin in this more intrinsic failure to be human. But then what do we do with these other things that do just seem like broken rules? And I think what it comes down to is just returning to our definitions of what it means to be made in the image of God. And we had 3 of them. So whereas the failure to be human, the way that I spend most of my time outlining in the lesson, seemed to major on the vocational view and the substantive view, and the substantive view mainly in the second section of the lesson, when we kind of branched into philosophy a little bit. The relational view, to some extent, was left to one side, and it features in the way that we treat each other, and we're given motivation for it in patterning the way that we treat each other on God. But there is a sense in which that is not quite as prominent, I guess. But I think the way that God wants to be worshipped and the way that God sets out in, say, a book like Leviticus, what that might look like and how the Israelites might be distinct from the other nations to show that they are particularly loyal to Yahweh and not the gods of the other nations, I think is something close to, or something that has more to do with the relational view. It's keeping our relationship with God intact. And I think depending on which rules you're reading and which laws you're reading, also our relationships with each other intact. That's kind of been my thinking about it. I don't know if you've got anything you want to add there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a helpful way to frame it. And I think it also helps explain another thing that we see in the Bible where the rules, a lot of the rules that we've been talking about, like they don't really continue through to the New Testament. Like we don't have to worry about food laws or a lot of the offerings that are described at the end of Leviticus. They fall away because we don't really have a temple anymore. So we can't like go to the temple and do these special offerings that they would do there. And that falling away, or that like change in what we have to do, tracks with the change in the kind of relationship that God has with humanity, right? So he's establishing different covenants, he's evolving the covenants and so on. And in doing so, he's changing the shape of the relationship that humans have with him. And so we would expect then for there to be a change in sort of what can you say, like the rights of that relationship, or
I guess how
the
that
appropriate
relationship
ways
looks.
to engage in it.
Yeah.
How it looks exactly. But then you would say that because some of those relational view things, we're not saying something like all laws that would be associated with the relational view fall away or something, or like change, because there'll be plenty that don't, right? Like love your God, or love the Lord your God, right? Would be like a really obvious one. Don't murder other people would also be a pretty good relationship with other human beings.
Yeah. It's not so easy to just compartmentalize and say, oh, well, when we do this, it's this view of the image of God that we're violating, or that view that we're violating. Chances are it's all very mixed together. There's some that seem a bit more readily compartmentalized, I guess. It sounds a bit silly to say eating pork is a failure to be truly human. I mean, when you put it like that, it sounds a bit odd. But what it did do for the Israelites was create friction in their relationship with God, to put it lightly. And that's a failure to be human. To do something that puts us at odds with our Creator is a failure to be human, because that's what we were designed to be. As his image bearers, we were created to be in relationship with him.
I see. So you could say something similar even in the garden then. It's not even like with the tree. There's nothing intrinsic about being a human that you're going to be near a tree of knowledge of good and evil or something. And there's nothing intrinsic about eating fruit from trees that's like good or bad. But it's like, okay, but now that you are in a relationship with God, in order to live fully as a human, it's to live in line with God's desires and for you as his creation, whatever that happens to look like.